I want to start off just by thanking our panelists for taking the time to present for us, doing all the work and everything that goes into this. The school for hosting us, obviously, and CAN TV for recording the event and broadcasting it in a couple weeks. So I'm just going to start off with a quick introduction into what Platypus is and what we do. So the Platypus Affiliated Society, established in December 2006, is an international student-based organization that hosts reading groups and public fora and publishes research and journalism, all focused on problems and tasks inherited from the old left of the 20s and 30s, the new left of the 60s and 70s, and the post-political left of the 80s and 90s for the possibilities of emancipatory politics today. The aim of Platypus is the self-criticism, self-education, and ultimately, the practical reconstitution of a Marxian left. Here at SAIC, we run a reading group every Wednesday from 6 to 9 in the McLean building, and we meet up for coffee breaks every Thursday from 4:30 to 6 at Cozy. In the broader Chicago area, Platypus also organizes panels on an almost monthly basis. So if you're interested in learning more about the organization or future events, we have a table over there with a sign-up sheet and copies of the Platypus Review. So I guess at this point I'll start introducing the panelists, left to right, or from nearest to me to furthest. So Joy Holowicki. Joy is a member of Rising Tide Chicago, an integrating member of Black Rose Anarchist Federation, Federación Anarquista Rosa Negra, and she is trying to form a worker-owned cooperative out of Ailey Solar Electric. Joy enjoys the writings of Guy Debord, Peter Kropotkin, Errico Malatesta, Antonio Negri, and Karl Marx, but she would not say that she is ideologically aligned or married to a given tradition, simply that she is a communist and an activist. Next to Joy, we have Peter Hudis. Peter Hudis is a member of the International Marxist Humanist Organization and is author of Marx's Concept to the Alternative to Capitalism and Frantz Fanon, Philosopher of the Barricades. He has co-edited The Power of Negativity, selected writings on the dialectic in Hegel and Marx by Raya Dunayevskaya, the Rosa Luxemburg Reader, and has edited or co-edited 3 volumes of the English language complete works of Rosa Luxemburg, of which he is general editor. He is professor of humanities and philosophy of Oakton Community College. Going down, Lindsay French is an artist and educator based in Chicago with a background in landscape studies and an MFA in art and technology studies. Lindsay embraces a number of mediation strategies to engage in gestures of communication with landscapes and the non-human. She's interested in the ways in which social, political, and personal landscapes model biological and ecological formations. Her most recent work, informed by research into plant communication, is organized around the attempt to find a phytocentric perspective. Lindsay is interested in plants and their dispersed communication methods, resistance to clear identity, and the strength of their passivity and weakness. She currently teaches courses that explore new media practices and site-specific research at the School of the Art Institute of Chicago and the Art and Technology Studies, Sculpture, and Contemporary Practices Department. Last but not least, Dr. Howard Ehrman. Dr. Ehrman is the grandfather of 3 beautiful grandchildren. Howard first learned about the environment from age 5 to 20 on his Moroccan grandfather's farm, who grew up as an indentured servant to a farmer in Romania until he escaped at age 20. Howard first learned of climate change from Professor Barry Commoner from 1965 to 68 at Washington University. He first learned about Marxism and Leninism in a class with John Kautsky, grandson of Karl Kautsky, in 1966 at Washington University. Howard has been a community organizer since 1961 and a union organizer since 1965, including being on the strike committee of the largest doctor strike in U.S. history in 1975 at Cook County Hospital. He was a newspaper editor and writer, 1973 to 81, and co-founder of the Little Village Environmental Justice Organization, 1994 to 2013. He's assistant professor, University of Illinois College of Medicine and School of Public Health, 1985 to present, and he is the chief medical officer of Will County. And just to give a brief layout for the panel for tonight, it's going to be divided into 3 parts. The first part is going to be opening remarks by the panelists. Each panelist will have 10 to 12 minutes to give their statements. After that, there's going to be a period for the panelists to respond to each other's remarks. So each panelist will then have 3 minutes. And then at the end, we'll have about an hour to do Q&A. And so before we begin, I'm just going to read the description of the event that we circulated to our panelists and asked them to respond to. The awareness of a growing planetary climate crisis in the 1990s appeared to coincide with a change, the final collapse of the traditional forces of what the old left, communism and social democracy, and the consolidation of what many characterize as neoliberalism. For many green thinkers and activists, the political strength of the right in the 1990s stymied any meaningful attempt to regulate greenhouse gas emissions. But the global reach of climate change also generated sustained international resistance, which appears unified in its opposition to fossil fuel extraction. For Naomi Klein and climate justice activists, the combined weight of this resistance could change everything when coupled with the erosion of neoliberalism's credibility, particularly in the wake of the 2008 financial crisis, and the assessment that climate change is inextricably bound up with capitalism. That is, that climate change cannot be regulated or solved using greener forms of capitalism, but would require a system change. Yet amidst the proliferation of activity, from blocking pipelines to campus fossil fuel divestment campaigns, to blockades to stop hydraulic fracking and mountaintop removal coal mining projects, and protests at international climate talks, it remains unclear how climate activism might lead to something different. US Democrats, for example, appear poised to benefit from discontent around inaction on climate change regulation, in spite of advancing neoliberal reforms in the 90s under Bill Clinton. In the EU, climate activism has taken a back seat to anti-austerity, as governments responsible for the strictest austerity are largely credited with leadership in decarbonizing their economies. In fact, while an agreement overhauling the Kyoto Protocol seems increasingly likely at the Paris Conference of Parties, the same cannot be said about the prospects for system change. The focus of this panel is to consider what remains unchanged by the climate crisis, where there seems to be a continued problem of how discontents under capitalism become readily integrated into new forms of capitalism, a process whereby we unwittingly contribute to the perpetuation of capitalism without intending to. We ask our panelists to consider how we might arrive at a post-carbon future from the left, that is, in a manner that generates greater consciousness of what capitalism is and how to potentially overcome it. What would a left response to climate change look like? How does this differ from the right? Okay. So I'm going to start off with Joy. Each speaker will have 10 to 12 minutes to present. I'll knock at 1 minute.
Just a request if people could probably speak a little closer to the mic.
Okay. Yeah. So I'll give a knock at 1 minute. When your time is running low, and then another knock when time is done. Okay.
Can I just remain seated?
Yeah.
Great. Okay. Can you all hear me? Great. So yeah, my name's Joy, and I'm with Rising Tide Chicago. Has anyone heard of Rising Tide? Yeah. So we're like addressing the root causes of climate change, which is, our casino capitalist system. And we do that by taking direct action. And hopefully I can explain some of that more. I'm really tired. I've been up since 4:30 a.m. And that's because it's related to everything I do. We were this morning, me and other members of Rising Tide, specifically 5 members, and then 2 community members from the southeast side of Chicago, were locked down in a blockade. So we were in lock boxes, basically PVC pipes with a pin in the middle so that we can hook on. And the police can't see where we're hooked, and so we can block things. So we were blocking truck entrances. And the reason we were doing that was because behind that truck entrance was a highly toxic substance known as petroleum coke. Have you ever heard of petroleum coke here? Yeah, so it's a byproduct of tar sands, also known as the worst oil in existence that's ruining magnificent forests in Canada and making its disgusting, sludgy way through pipelines all the way to Chicago on the southeast side. And through its as a byproduct of the refinery, it still holds value. You can still burn it again, but it's so dirty that we ship it to places like China and Mexico, where they burn it for its oil value. And so it's this light, fluffy substance. They carry it in on open trains, open trucks to this terminal where they hold it before they ship it. And so it's lots of children in the area have asthma, and, you know, the asthma van visits the elementary schools. And the community was successful in shutting down 2 terminals, so they just went out of business as soon as Rahm Emanuel, Mayor Rahm, announced the ordinances and the regulations, and they said, you know what, we're out, but the terminal known as KCBX, which is owned by the Koch brothers, infamous oil capitalists, oil industrialists in America. They refused. They sued the city. They're still suing the city. The city is not making them comply with the regulations they do have. And so the community and members of Rising Tide decided to take direct action and make it very clear that this is a serious issue. So serious that we were willing to be arrested and call attention. So yeah, I think it went off really well. We, you know, hit coverage in all the major news stations in Chicago. We, you know, stopped like 50 trucks, and yeah, everyone felt really uplifted and encouraged. Thanks. Dan's here. Dan was in the action. Yeah, so yeah, I feel great about that, even though I look like shit. What else? Yeah, so there are different tendencies in Rising Tide, and this is relevant for this panel, because this panel is about the left, which I find really interesting, because it's a very minoritarian position as far as my experience goes. And so for me and for people of this tendency within Rising Tide, which is like an anarchist tendency, we believe that the left is defined by a revolution. So revolution in this case would be overturning the forces of production that reproduce this social order that we have in society. And so the forces of production being capitalism, white supremacy, patriarchy, imperialism, and the state. And so, yeah, that's a definite tendency in Rising Tide. I don't know if you knew that. It's also a definite tendency in the climate justice movement generally. But because of the political climate we are in, we don't speak that way. We speak in terms of direct democracy. We speak in terms of building the new in the shell of the old, and various things like that. But we are definitely of an ambitious tone, which means that we don't want things to just change for now to save us from this disaster, which is also another tendency. People are very inclined to just please just save us from climate change, which is very understandable. And some of us believe that yeah, it could go either way in terms of how much damage can happen. And in terms of the science, I think it's like up in the air. Capitalism could possibly solve climate change in some sense, in some meaningful sense, in the sense that most of the world's poor doesn't die, right? That could happen. But I and everyone else of my persuasion would rather not would rather not take the chance of standing on the sidelines and seeing if that happens, if I could say that. Yeah, so what else? As it relates to other leftists, I think we would be slightly different in the sense that in terms of acting and moving forwards, strategy is less clear, action is more clear, and action is what we feel is needed, and ethics are very important to us. So for instance, when we do an action, we're not necessarily looking to advance on a particular analysis. We're looking forward to solve a practical problem and build from there. So this is great in terms of the problems we face with the fossil fuel industry. There are lots of problems, not just climate change, abstract global problems like that, abstract global problems of capitalism and inequities, but also very practical problems like my child has gotten asthma, please do something about it. My neighborhood is full of truck traffic, and I have to sleep at night. So we look for a practical problem, and we don't make barriers to entry for action. We come together in a directly democratic way, a consensual way, a way that everyone has a voice, and we come to an agreement based on unified principles and unified principles and a willingness to act in order to advance our front. So people from many different foundations and different analysis can come together. I have a lot of stories. I have a lot of different angles that I see this from. I'm also part of a group that's trying to form a worker-owned cooperative for a solar energy company. I think that we need to distribute energy ownership. I think that's a really great and tangible way to sort of address the problems of capitalism. And so one other part of this whole panel is the whole problem, if you're focused on climate and oil, how is that going to get us to revolution? How is that going to get us to the new? And I think there's a lot of different ways you can go at this, and this is where it becomes more analysis-based. This is where it becomes more strategically based. And so these are theories. These are not concrete realities. These are not scientific certainties. These are, even if there is such a thing as scientific certainty, these are scaffolds. These are possibilities. These are optimistic visions that people with more and more leadership in this, that are directly involved, that develop their leadership, gain a knowledge of and know of and vision cast and bring people alongside them in a way that is consensual. And that is very important, that we try to maintain the values that we want to see in the future society. So bottom line, there's different theories. Like affect theory, there's a lot of emotion, there's a lot of heat around fossil fuel issues. Also very conveniently, fossil fuels are connected to capital and finance. So you can begin to see if we challenge fossil fuels and, oh, by the way, they're connected to finance, what can happen with that? And personally, I've seen, companies like spin out of control. I've seen the fracking industry go bankrupt. And so, and then, there were talks, is the government going to bail out the fracking industry because, they prop them up? And what would happen if the government just bailed out people instead? And, different things like that. So capital and the fossil fuel industry are connected. That could be a way forward for more revolutionary basic change. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. My name is Peter Hudis. Today, I think it's pretty clear that we're experiencing an environmental crisis of such depth and severity that the very basis of social reproduction is being called into question. And certainly there's not a single society on the face of the earth that is not engaged in this interminable process of destroying the natural environment. That much is certainly clear. What's not so clear is what's driving this process and what has to be done to reverse it. In my view, any critique of global warming and environmental destruction fails on both counts to answer those questions if it's not rooted in a Marxian understanding of the nature of capitalist value production. Now, to be sure, ecological destruction occurred in many pre-capitalist societies, as I think we're all aware, whether it be the decline of ancient Sumerian civilization due to extensive irrigation, the decline of the Roman Empire due to massive deforestation in order to build those big buildings and colosseums, or the collapse of ancient Mayan civilization due to overexploitation of water and other forest resources. But capitalism has an especially egregious impact on the environment because it's driven to produce value, which is, of course, wealth computed in monetary terms, as an end in itself. That is, the aim of production and reproduction in capitalism is not to generate material wealth, nor is it to generate use values, nor is it to satisfy human needs. Its aim is to augment exchange value. Use values are finite magnitudes. You can only use so many shoes, clothes, or food. But exchange value is a potentially infinite magnitude. The question is, why is it an infinite magnitude? The reason, at least as Marx argued, is that exchange value is a phenomenal expression of value. That is, the value of a commodity is based not on the actual amount of time that it takes to produce it, but on the average amount of time that it's necessary to produce it. That is, to give an example, a worker may spend 10 hours making a product, but that does not mean that she is engaged in 10 hours of value-creating labor. If the average amount of time that is needed on the world market or to produce that product is only, let's say, 6 hours, the extra 4 hours of labor that she performs making that product creates no value from a capitalist point of view. This means that the worker is constantly pressured to produce in accordance with an abstract average, socially necessary labor time. The worker, that is not in control of time. Time instead confronts us as a person apart and subjects us to its will. This means that it's not true that labor is the source of all value. Actually, the source of value is not actual concrete labor, but rather abstract labor. Labor reduced to a homogeneous abstraction by being governed by socially necessary labor time. Now, socially necessary labor time is a constantly changing magnitude. Every invention of a new machine or labor-saving device lessens the amount of labor time that counts as necessary. The worker is therefore under constant pressure to conform to an ever-changing abstract average. The question then is there any finite limit to this drive to obey the dictates of socially necessary labor time? The answer is no, because what dominates us is an abstract average, and abstractions, by definition, escape finite limits. Since the drive to force us to conform to socially necessary labor time is relentless, so is the drive to augment value. From the capitalist standpoint, in other words, there's never enough value extracted from the worker. No sooner is a given amount of value created in making a product than the socially necessary labor time further declines, which devalues part of what was earlier counted as the value of the product. And therefore, we're driven to produce more in a short amount of time just to keep up with the level of value production as dictated by the world market. There's no end to this drive. It's a never-ending cycle, precisely because production is geared not for human needs, but to serve the dictates of capital, which is another word for self-expanding value. Value production, by its very nature, therefore, as I would put it, is an endless quest for an infinite magnitude. Now, as I think we're all aware, natural resources are a finite magnitude. There's only so much water, trees, and oil on the face of the earth. But ignore all of that, says the system we're living under. We're engaged in an infinite drive to augment value. And since we cannot produce more in a short amount of time without increasing the exploitation of nature, that's just the price that has to be paid, says the capitalist, for economic progress. This process of exploiting and raping nature is as relentless as this drive to augment value itself. So what's the logical outcome of this? The logical outcome, I think, is the destruction of the very basis of human and natural existence. And we now see living proof of this with the threat that global warming can actually put an end to civilization, human civilization as we have known it. But capital doesn't care. You know, Marx once said that every capitalist lives by the model, after me the deluge. I think that he was quite right. I just want to give one quote from Marx, because I think it's interesting in this discussion. He wrote this in his Grundrisse. Quote, "Capital is the endless and limitless drive to go beyond its limiting barrier. Every boundary is and has to be a barrier for it, else it would cease to be capital, or money as self-reproductive. If capital perceived a certain barrier not as a boundary, but became comfortable within it as a boundary, it would have declined from exchange value to use value. Capital is the constant movement to create more of the same," end quote. Now, I think that this pinpoints why capitalism, unlike any other previous system, is so environmentally destructive. No system is more driven to destroy the environment because none before it was driven to accumulate monetary value for its own sake. So my point here is that if we fail to locate why there is so much environmental destruction in the modern world, it'll be much harder for us to ultimately effectively reverse it. Now, I certainly agree that taking on even the most modest steps, such as reducing personal consumption levels, taking greater care of our natural surroundings and our everyday behavior, throwing ourselves in front of the locomotive of this destruction of the environment whenever possible to slow it down, is absolutely necessary. But we cannot halt the destruction of this locomotive, this destruction of the environment, without putting an end to the system of value production ultimately, a system that's now integral to the entire global economy. Now, you might ask, but did many regimes over the last 100 years that claim to be socialist or Marxist produce a great deal of environmental destruction as well? The answer is, you bet. However, none of these statist socialist or communist regimes, in my view, surmounted the social relations associated with capitalism. The predominant view among orthodox Marxists of the 20th century is that socialism is defined by the abolition of private ownership of the means of production and a more equal distribution of value. They failed to notice that a more equitable distribution of monetary wealth, even if they achieved that, which most didn't, and the elimination of private property does not abolish capitalism. These regimes did not break from value production, like the Soviet Union. They merely managed production for the sake of augmenting value through the vehicle of an authoritarian state. And they didn't break from value production because they made no effort to abolish abstract or alienated labor at the point of production. They didn't change the mode of production fundamentally. The law of value governed their every move. These state capitalist societies, therefore, were and are no less destructive of nature than free market ones. Now, unfortunately, I think even some of capitalism's most sharpest critics of its war on nature often fail to notice or pay attention to this. For instance, John Bellamy Foster has done some very important work in highlighting capitalism's destructive approach to nature, and I recommend his work in many respects. However, in a recent article, he argues that the existence of private property and private profits explains why nature is treated today as an object to be manipulated and destroyed. But I think that fails to take into account the massive environmental destruction that occurred in the USSR, as seen in one of the greatest environmental catastrophes in human history, the destruction of the massive Aral Sea from the 1950s onward. You ever see those satellite pictures of what the Aral Sea looked like in the early 1950s? Right? One of the largest inland bodies of water on Earth and what it looks like today, which is a little tiny river or something. It's like equivalent of Lake Michigan drying out. Now, in order to curb or reverse the negative, destructive environmental impact of modern society, therefore, my argument is that a far deeper and wide-ranging transformation of society is needed than has been advocated by most reform-minded environmentalists and previous revolutionary movements. It's tempting to think that environmental destruction is primarily a result of tangible physical factors, like the size of the Earth's population, the amount of economic output in quantitative terms, or the availability of resources. But these are neo-Malthusian arguments. And neo-Malthusian arguments, I think, fail to get to the crux of the matter. They're very attractive because they make sense when you only look at things on the superficial level of surface appearance of society. But we have to look deeper than that. And the only way out, as I see it, ultimately, is to transform conditions of life and labor so that the process of production and reproduction is no longer governed by a temporal abstraction outside of human subjective control. That is, we're going to have to get to the point sooner rather than later, and start experimenting with this sooner rather than later, of creating alternative social relations in which the participants themselves, instead of some abstract, impermeable social average, governs their activity. That is, concrete, sensuous human relations must cease to be governed by an abstract external measure. Abstract labor and all other kinds of routinized, quantified activity, whether it be in relations of labor or race or gender, must give way to a society that treats people as what they are, contingent, finite, sensuous beings. Or as Marx put it, to be sensuous is to suffer because you recognize your limits. There's no way out of them. Capitalism, however, wants to convince us that there are no limits. Only when the process of production and reproduction of material life is transformed will value production therefore come to an end. And only then will the destruction of nature begin to be reversed, on a systemic level at least. It seems to me that any approach that shies away from this, whether it be a reversion back to orthodox Marxism, neo-Malthusianism, or cynicism about the possibility of effecting radical change, stands in the way of a viable solution. We're facing a huge problem, therefore, but we can't tackle this problem and even begin to get our hands around it if we proceed from the assumption that fundamentally the time is past to effect a fundamental social change in this country and around the world. I think, frankly, the time is first beginning. There's a lot of promising signs that there is a new generation emerging that takes these issues very seriously. And I think the heart of that is, in a certain sense, the anti-racist struggles we've seen emerge in Europe and America over the last year. I think these will be the harbinger of something new.
Okay, can you hear me? Okay. So part of my interest in being here today is not necessarily to come up with any kind of strong answer to the questions that were posed or prompted to us, but maybe to articulate a position, and in this opportunity, a multitude of positions, or a number of practices that aim towards the more interstitial spaces between the fixed moments in these broader and maybe more grand narratives that we all try to hold, or most of us try to hold, when addressing things like climate change. So the prompts we were given proposed a number of questions, and in every question a certain tone was assumed. And part of that tone is a tone of urgency, and it's understandable when we're presented with these undeniable facts, or undeniable in a scientific sense, being 95% true, which is undeniable. I also feel that sense of urgency, and with it, an anxiety, which I think is a tone that permeates a lot of our social existence together. And there's also a significant amount of guilt, and not to mention denial, kind of culturally, and other fallout from these affective responses to something that's permeated every experience that we have. I really appreciate in trying to understand and grapple with this the term Anthropocene, not just because, and the Anthropocene is this proposed term by geologists that suggests that humans have been the most significant influence on the planet and its material structure. And it's a term that's been quite easily absorbed, I think, partly because it speaks to the sticky nature of our existence on this planet, as part of this planet. And it's kind of speaks to the inability to remove ourselves from something that's so insidious we can't really see a difference between it and us. And I think there's a lot of potential there. In some ways, I think this term can give us a framework to begin to think about climate change or feel climate change or to address climate change. And partly that's because we can consider the Anthropocene in the way that we consider geology, which is slow, residual, operating at a time scale where we can feel a certain amount of distance and remove. And that amount of distance can, for me, remove a little bit of the anxiety and give a certain amount of false or precarious framework. And even if what we're talking about, which in this case is humans being the most geologically influential species on the planet, it's a position that we can't remove ourselves from. So these are just kind of practices of decentering. So it's from here that I want to begin with a number of proposals for the questions posed. And particularly I'm interested in the question, how might we arrive at a post-carbon future from the left, i.e. in a manner that generates greater consciousness of what capitalism is and how to potentially overcome it. Because I think within that question are a lot of statements that I'd like to challenge, at least for myself, and try to decenter from. So these questions, these proposals are not meant to be answers or even action points, but maybe modes I'd like to consider approaching within this particular opportunity today to grapple with these really hard questions and these multitude of approaches. So in the deep responsibility of identifying with the most geologically influential species on the planet, might we find a moment of reprieve and even reflection in thinking toward the longer term moments on the planet. So the geological term Anthropocene gives us this ability to think across time, to think geologically in the deep layers and the sediment of the earth. But rather than deconstructing, it gives us this broader view, a way of conceiving a whole. And it's slow but not static. Rocks move. And over time, they tell the kinds of narratives that we can read when we're understanding climate change information. In fact, this is where a lot of our climate change information has come from, looking at carbon trapped in different materials. And it's also to try to conceive of a climate is to try to address the otherwise unaddressable. So climate is this huge, it's the unaddressable. It's a thing that you can't wrap your head around, your brain around, so you have to feel it. And when we do, it's terrifying. But I think with the Anthropocene, with this term, we can momentarily map this idea of climate change onto something that's slower. And beyond the full responsibility of a single human lifespan, which I think is where a lot of the challenges come. The human lifespan, but also the 5-year plan of a business. So this is not at all to say that we cannot and should not take responsibility for our actions and for our daily actions. But what I'd like to propose is questioning the we in that sentence. Who is this we, and how can we overcome climate change? How can we arrive at a post-carbon future from the left? So I wonder in these moments of defining a we, if we might consider other organisms, other materials, and maybe brush up against those strict boundaries that have been mentioned already, those kind of boundaries and barriers to understanding. I think it also opens up beyond that, or maybe through that, some questions of the social justice that are at a core of a lot of these issues. By practicing these ways of extending our boundaries to the timescale of a rock, for example, or of a plant. We might be able to take it back and say, oh, this we is also this other human being. It's a practice, a way of destabilizing or decentering the self. And so in some ways, climate change really begs this human question because that's the we that's implicit in the questions that were posed today. But I wonder if some of the anthropocentric problems, anthropocentric approach to these anthropogenic problems might itself be a problem. So in my own research and explorations, I look to plants for a number of ways, as was mentioned a little bit earlier. And there's a whole reason for that. But a plant, or more precisely our encounters and identity of them, oscillates between organism and environment, between this landscape and the individual. And by looking to plants and their kind of extreme interiority and their intelligence that goes beyond a centralized nervous system, so plants store memory and signaling kind of in this very dispersed way, that we might actually find a number of practices in shifting a way of thinking or being or behaving or resisting to arrive at this post-carbon future with maybe a different assemblage of bodies. And I'd like to take a really short detour for a moment, maybe because I'm an art teacher, I don't know, but to consider the sublime. And I think it relates a little bit to what the previous two panelists were talking about. But in art history, we can look to the sublime as this era of maybe landscape painting that was charged with a certain amount of urgency that we still relate to. And it was happening in this moment of Western environmental history, but also a kind of global environmental moment of the Industrial Revolution, where a lot of the terminology and ways of thinking about capital arose. And it was in those moments that images were being made and landscapes were being explored in this way that we were kind of inserting ourselves into these like rather extreme versions and visions of the landscape. And kind of next to that, I'd like to think about student loan debt, which is another kind of sublime experience, trying to think of something that's much larger than any one of us could consider. I think of the kind of contemporary sublime in this experience of kind of willingly entering into a number of experiences and a number of relationships through production, not just production of knowledge or goods, but maybe cultural production that is just beyond anything that we can grasp or grapple with. So I think it's in those moments that especially a kind of maybe a newer generation, or at least a newer kind of experience, we have a lot of practice in these kinds of terms. And that's a small example, but I think there's a lot of practice dealing with anxiety around these kind of sublime, larger than understandable tones and moods that surround us. I'd also like to mention a little bit of maybe what I think about when I think about capital, because I think I'm coming from quite a different perspective than the other panelists here today. And when I think about capital, I think about my ecology classes in undergrad and looking towards the planet as a semi-closed system where the sun was bringing in energy and being stored in these number of ways. And in the 70s, a group of ecologists led by this guy named Vituzik looked at the net produced power of the planet, which is the amount of sun that comes in every day, every year on the planet. And he started to look at human appropriated net produced power, how much of the Earth's energy was being stored by humans and used by humans. And in those moments of trying to finally put a framework around how much energy humans were using, we had this kind of clear understanding of the intensity that humans were affecting the planet. And so I'd like to end on one quote from Michael Marder, who looks at plants and wrote this great essay called "Resist Like a Plant." And he writes, "Standing in for the other, in which the plant's being accomplishes itself without reflectively returning to itself, capital eclipses the sun and power of the nutrients contained in the earth." And I think I'll end there.
Well, we want to thank Patrick Platypus. I've never heard of platypus actually, so I'd rather know more platypus. Everybody hear me? How about now? All right. So I'm going to talk about experiences and some of the literature that's out. Some of us in the world, not just locally, are talking about a question called revolutionary transition. How many people have heard the expression just transition in the climate justice movement? Okay, so I don't think just transition is good enough. Just transition refers to the concept that was made up by large NGOs and trade unions that we should transition from a fossil fuel economy, and the workers shouldn't get hurt in this transition, to a green, renewable energy. Sounds like a good concept, except things were not equal and aren't equal in a fossil fuel economy. So a just transition leaves out the fact that in the energy sector, just to take a small example, 95% of the people who work there are white males. It's made up of large craft unions who have excluded people of color and women. And it's well documented by the Bureau of Labor Statistics if anybody wants anything. Okay, John Bellamy Foster wrote an article. You heard one of our previous speakers talk about him, where he characterizes a revolutionary transition as 2 steps. I don't agree that they should be 2 steps. I think they have to be going on simultaneously. We have to have struggles for radical reforms, radical transformative reforms right now. And we have to build a broad movement to carry us forward. Long revolutionary transition. I don't think we have a lot of time for a long revolutionary transition. I think we have to think it out, talk with each other like we are tonight. We maybe have 10 years, maybe 15, before we get beyond the tipping point in terms of climate change. New data is coming out every day that shows that hopefully we've got that long, but maybe not. In terms of some Marxists that are actually still alive, who talk about a different way than traditional ways, I think, to approach socialism, one is Marta Honegger. She's a Chilean Marxist originally who was part of the Allende government, then became a close advisor to both Fidel Castro and to Hugo Chavez. She has written, I think, some really important information about the question of the relationship between democracy and democratic centralism, which I think is a break to a certain extent from the past views of socialism and how actually socialist governments and parties, including communist parties, have been structured. Her husband now is Michael Leibowitz. I'd highly recommend a book he wrote in 2011, The Socialist Alternative, where he clearly lays out what's a bottom-up approach to socialism. Questions that Peter rose about the people who are actually working, or communities that are actually doing things like urban agriculture, democratically having a say in participating in decisions. This is quite different than state socialism, which is primarily the way it was practiced in the Soviet Union, originally in China, where I think now clearly we have state capitalism, and some other countries. So what's an example of a clear break from the past in terms of a country that's declared itself socialist? I think the #1 example clearly is what happened in Cuba over the question of food, which now is known as agroecology, and a term that's been developed actually not by the Cubans, but by their allies in the world's largest organization by far, 200 million people in La Villa Campesina, who call this food sovereignty. Food sovereignty is quite different than concepts in the US of food justice, food democracy, food first, food this. Food sovereignty means that the people who are growing the food and live around the growth of the food actually control the food systems. It's different than what we do in Chicago with the plant and with all these other mostly urban farms that basically grow food to sell to Whole Foods, to fancy restaurants, and very little food goes to the people of Englewood, back of the yards, and other places where it's grown. Quite a different concept. This did not happen because it was planned by the state or the Communist Party of Cuba. This happened because of the fall of the Soviet Union, when their fundamental lifeline, because of the boycott of US imperialism, was cut off. And people individually and collectively, first in cities and now in rural areas, have developed a whole system of food production that is now extended to many parts of the world. This has been resisted by some people in the Communist Party. Other people have welcomed it. It's been a tug of war, particularly in rural areas where you might now know that Raul and the Communist Party have decided not just to give people land, but to actually give them title ownership over the land after 3 years if they can keep a certain amount of production. So this is a fundamental change that's happened. It's the relationship between a socialist state and a certain amount of growing democracy in Cuba. We'll see how long that lasts now that they have a relationship with the US. There's a concept I think some of you may have heard of. How many people have heard of the concept living well, not living better? Anybody? This was kind of popularized by President Evo Morales in Copenhagen in 2009 at that COP15 meeting 6 years ago. And it's a really important concept that doesn't come primarily from Evo. It's not a recent concept. It's been a concept embedded in thousands of years in indigenous life all over the world, but particularly in the Western Hemisphere, where the idea is living better can only be done by exploiting both people and nature, whereas living well is a much more collective understanding of how we need to live together, including living together with nature. There's been very few papers actually translated or written in English about the concept of living well, but if you want any of them, I'd be happy to send them to you. But there's 3 fundamental concepts that most of the papers have been written in Spanish and English. One is to rely on indigenous traditions, including visions of the cosmos. It does a fundamental break with concept of development that I'll get into in a minute, and it focuses on the relationship to nature as a primary starting point. Some of this was concretely done in terms of developed at the World's Conference on Climate Change and the Rights of Mother Earth that happened 5 years ago in Cochabamba. It was the largest gathering of people from all over the world. About 30,000 of us were there. A very large number of indigenous people, not just from the Western Hemisphere, every country, but also from the Eastern Hemisphere. It starts off by basically talking about the capitalist system, and I don't want to repeat all this. I think it's very clear that in terms of some of the terms and concepts that Peter put forward, there is a constant drive for a certain type of value that's created by capitalism. That's infinite. It's not going to stop. And so anyone who thinks that we can solve the problem of climate change under capitalism, it's a fundamental contradiction, whether you agree with capitalism or not, in terms of what scientifically and what practically it is. Somebody in the US who I think has made an important contribution that unfortunately most people haven't heard of these days was my former professor, Barry Commoner. Barry Commoner studied Marxism when he was in college during World War II. He applied some of the concepts of Marxism, I think some of the concepts actually of Marx's relationship to nature, probably more importantly than any scientist in the 20th century. Some of these are summed up in a book called The Closing Circle, which I'd highly recommend people read. It's not available in terms of being published anymore, but you can get used copies on Amazon in your library where it's free. 4 concepts that, as you can see, kind of go along quite a bit with the idea of living well. Everything is connected to everything else. Everything must go somewhere. Nature knows best. There is no such thing as a free lunch. This is a really important concept to the big greens, who basically think that all we have to do is switch out fossil fuels for renewable energy and everything's going to be dandy. because renewable energy just happens if we snap our fingers. You know, there's no silica problems with little kids and minors digging silica out of the ground, getting into their lungs, dying of silicosis. There's no problem with the heavy metals from photovoltaic cells. And so that one of the big elephants in the room here, I don't know if you can see them, is the idea that if we don't decrease our per capita energy use, not just in the global south, but global north, but in the macro cities of the global south, the game's over whether we switch to renewables or not. In this conference, how much time do I have left? Yeah. In this conference in Cochabamba, unfortunately, Evo Morales had a hard time living up to all of his words that sounded very nice because he excluded a huge group of indigenous people with some small NGO allies called Table 18. They actually met right outside the conference gates. And they basically took on the fact that unfortunately countries that are progressive in terms of redistribution of wealth, in terms of giving rights to indigenous groups, to Afro-Venezuelans, to Afro-Peruvians and others, unfortunately have followed the same development model as U.S. imperialists. This is a neo-extractive model. Naomi Klein talks about it a bit in her book. But it's very important because it's the concept that Peter referred to in terms of the Soviet Union, that basically socialism does okay sometimes in terms of redistribution of wealth and power and giving rights to national minorities, to women sometimes. It doesn't do much better in terms of actual development and taking things out of Mother Earth. So one important concept that segues with Peter's is the idea that in a state socialist enterprise characterized by what happened under Stalin and continues today with the Chinese, there is profit that's created. The problem is it doesn't go to the workers. It goes to the state in a centralized, undemocratic committee, particularly now with the Chinese Capitalist Party, to decide then how to do it and what to do with it. It's a very important concept that people don't want to talk about. So the concept in Table 18, which again, it's hard to find these in English, but I have the articles, is a question that's based fundamentally on applying the idea of living well. This is just kind of repeating the idea that what we if you want to believe in socialism, which I do, ideally in terms of, I think particularly in Marx's later half of his life, then we have to deal with the question of what's our relationship to Mother Earth. Development has to be defined differently, and the question of how value, surplus value, different types of value is created has to be different. One way to do this practically is around the question right now under capitalism of what we call the revolutionary transformation, democratization, and expansion of the public sector, excluding, of course, police and prisons. We think this is an important concept because everything in terms of Mother Earth is being privatized, all space is being privatized, and to take this to its end in terms of fighting against the privatization of everything would lead us, we think, in a revolutionary direction. There's a project called the Solutions Project based in Stanford. We think we need to have a revolutionary solutions project because we don't have till 2050. Finally, we think that the next step in terms of the partial victory of the Keystone XL pipeline is what people have started doing to unite with the Global South, and that is to keep all fossil fuels plus uranium in the ground. So we have to look at this concretely. Lastly, again, to segue off what Peter said, I asked this question in Cochabamba among about 500 Canadians and U.S. Fellow participants. I said, do you think it's possible, theoretically, that capitalism could move from fossil fuels to renewable energy? About half the people raised their hand, and so then I asked the other people, why not? I think theoretically it's quite possible. This is always a contradiction among the capitalists themselves, but certain capitalists are moving in that direction, and it's going to happen with what we call green fascism. We have fascism now in the United States. We're moving to greater fascism. We're basically affected unequally based on race, gender, nationality, but we have to recognize this is quite possible, even though it's not probable. And the last thing I want to say is that if we're going to get off the dime in terms of climate justice, the first thing we have to do is unite with real people's movements in the U.S. and around the world. Black Lives Matter, the Fight for 15, the question of DACA, stop deportation and Islamophobia. Thank you very much.
Okay. So now we're going to have a short period for the panelists to respond to each other. Starting with Joy, give them 3 minutes each.
Hello. Great, yeah. There's lots to agree with. I also think we need a revolutionary solutions project, but if I said that to some of the people that are in my group, they'd be like, you're a jerk. Yeah, so how do we approach, you know, what I think of when I hear these things is like, okay, how do I like take this back to the streets and do this shit, you know? Like, that's what I think about. You know, unite with people's movements. I think Rising Tide has tried to do some of these things. So we have something called Flood the System, and so we want to, you know, COP21 is coming up where all the global leaders are going to meet to talk about climate change, and they're, even the pre-standards that they've issued, MIT has said, you know, this is definitely not good enough, even if they come to those agreements. And so what we're trying to do is, like, with Flood the System, is like gather all the groups together and recognize that the climate crisis is from capitalism, white supremacy, patriarchy, all these things. And so all these groups in Chicago, like BYP 100, Black Lives Matter, you know, FLY, Fearless Leading Youth, all these groups, if we could just come together and do actions together, have practical targets, start meeting together, talking about these things and creating these actions, you know, we would flood the system. We would say that the climate crisis is due to all of these things and we all need to work together. That's definitely something that's on my heart, but making that happen is a big question in my mind. And then pursuant to radicalizing people among me, we have been successful. It's not impossible. So like we show it through getting things done. Like Rising Tide is very aggressive. We cost, you know, TransCanada in the southern KXL like $5 million with our blockades. Every time we do something, we're just a little group, we cost these groups lots of money. We win. And so like groups like 350, these more moderate groups are starting, you know, I've just heard that they're planning more actions, more direct actions, more grassroots organizing. And so we are radicalizing, that's one of our goals, is to radicalize these other groups, the Sierra Club, the other groups, to do direct action, to work with others in a more radical way that we feel. So that's sort of two thoughts in my mind, and then what Lindsay said, I have to think about it.
Well, I think we have to acknowledge the fact that getting our arms wrapped around this problem, not just of climate change, but of destruction of natural species, which I think is just as important, frankly, is a really difficult problem, especially when you're an activist, and I have a lot of experience in that, because it requires thinking out some really difficult theoretical issues that are inseparable from your practice, but that often get subsumed in political activity, especially in short-term political activity. But I think we really have to find ways to make space within our organizing and our activity to really think out these seemingly abstract theoretical questions, like what's driving this destruction of nature. Because if we don't get a handle on that, ultimately our activism becomes counterproductive. I think we always have to be wary, given where we are, that is in the United States, that we're always more the products of American culture than we often think we are, even when think of ourselves as very radical. And I always realize this whenever I go outside the country. Pragmatism and disdain for theory is really deeply rooted in aspects of the history of the American left. And I think we have to make our own movements a kind of thinking body to think out these issues. Now, just quickly, where did I find the most intensive theoretical discussions about what's driving climate change personally? In the highland communities in Bolivia, in the Altiplano. I spent 2 months there this summer. There's one thing that you go up to 14,000 feet and you go to these very isolated indigenous communities of Quechua and especially Aymara. There's one thing nobody questions, and that's that climate change is happening. They know it, they know it's happening. They can see it every year. They got to grow potatoes on higher and higher level because of the fungus that's increasing with global warming because of the damp conditions further down. But they're also, in many of these communities, having some pretty serious discussion about how to change this. The question that's very open, that's not answered, is where there's a lot of discussion about living well and these principles based on the Ayul, communal structures in the countryside, as an alternative to the capitalist development model. What's not fleshed out still in these discussions is what kind of economic mode of production becomes the expression of living well. Right? That's being discussed in Bolivia, but we have to be part of that discussion as well. Lastly, there's a really good book that just came out that addresses a lot of these issues about whether you can have capitalism and climate change at the same time. Fossil Capital by Andreas Malm. I really recommend people read it because it really shows that the move to fossil fuel through the Industrial Revolution and afterwards was not driven by anything other than the logic of capital, and I think it's a helpful study to bring into this discussion.
I agree with Joy that there's a lot of kind of things to agree with that are happening here, and I think that in particular, addressing, Howard, some of your points about the elephant in the room being using less energy, you know, extracting less. A lot of these proposals, a lot of these actions are actually these kinds of passive actions and things that we have to get into in a way of kind of feeling or experiencing in order to actually do them. And so I would say that in addition to some of the actions in these groups that have the possibility of coming together, as Joy suggested, there need to be included some of these, in addition to the revolution, are these acts of resistance as well that I think come from the more personal moments or even private moments, if there can be such a thing, and then kind of turning those private moments outward again. One other thing to say is this idea of, I guess the thinking body, like how do we relate to one another? How can we all start to think towards a post-carbon future? And I think that there's a lot of room for multiple ways of thinking and multiple ways of kind of acting these things out. One other thing to kind of think about that I've been running over quite a bit is this idea of a lot of the actions that are occurring come around these ideas of visibility, like with police brutality and kind of a lot of these things becoming quite visible and not ignorable, and yet the action doesn't seem to do anything. Like, to know these things is not quite enough. The action, even the action of viewing, is not enough. So how do we get to those other moments of change? And I think some of that comes into practicing listening, practicing, stepping down, practicing these kind of more, especially if you're in a position of power, to kind of step down and allow for other voices to be heard, other things to be seen. So on that note.
Well, I want to thank all my fellow panelists and make a few comments on maybe what each person had to say. To Joy, I would say, first of all, I think Rising Tide is a great organization, both here and internationally. As a founding member of the Little Village Environmental Justice Organization, Rising Tide worked with us, tirelessly to not just close down the 2 coal power plants, but to take direct action. I'm a firm believer in direct action. I think how we do it in relationship, particularly to communities of color, is something that has to be continually thought about. And what I mean in terms of going to where the people's movements are is exactly that. Inviting people to our meetings or our events, that's a nice thing, that's being very polite. That's not going to cut it because we have a fundamental contradiction in the United States, the heart of imperialism. In survey after survey that's been done by, radical groups like the RAND Corporation, Pew Foundation, et cetera, African American and Latinos range between 82 to 88% of people who are basically fundamentally concerned in the deepest way about climate change. I want to repeat that, 82 to 88%. Among whites, it's never been more than about 40 to 50%. So it's not like people aren't concerned about it, but because of racism in all forms in our country, and I think we all understand at least a little bit about what that means, it doesn't mean people necessarily don't want to come to your event or don't want to come to our direct action or don't want to come to whatever. So the first thing we have to do is do what I call, we've been calling for over a century, solidarity and mutual aid. It's not missionary work, it's not feeling sorry for people, it's in our own interest when it's appropriate based on what people are asking us to do. So that's number one. The question that Peter asked, a really fundamental question about what's going on in the Andes, 14,000 feet up. I think that basically, not only does La Via Campesina have a partial answer for that, they started working 20 years ago with scientists, anthropologists all over the world to say that the best way to cool the planet is small, as far as possible, organic farming. Okay, this started 20 years ago. Now it's been proven in scientific study after scientific study, and now even the Special Rapporteur at the United Nations in October 2011 has confirmed this. So I think that's one thing that has to do with the mode of production. They actually have proven that small farms under 100 hectares or less, which is 220 acres, can actually outproduce large industrial farming. The last thing I'd like to do is make a comment about Lindsay's point. I totally agree that individually we have to do everything we can. I hated having to drive downtown today, but I'm coming from Joliet. It would have taken me 3 hours to get here, but that's the way our society is structured. So what I mean by decreased per capita energy use is not going home and turning off the lights, although that's important. What I mean is macro conservation. Okay, we have to restructure the built economy and everything about our society. Some of that I think we can do in a revolutionary way under capitalism, but that's only to get us off of capitalism.
Okay, so now I'd like to open up the discussion to the floor. So we're going to do Q&A. Yeah, can we get another mic? Yeah. Okay. Aaron?
I have a question primarily for Peter concerning the points that you brought up in your opening presentation. You talked a bit, you mentioned towards the end kind of problems with the neo-Malthusian argument, and I thought that was very nice of you to bring up, but it troubled me trying to reconcile it with kind of how you started your argument, which was talking about our limited natural resources on Earth, as opposed to and contradicting this unlimited imperative to produce value in capitalism. And so you brought up the Grundrisse quote about capitalism telling us that we are unlimited and that kind of being a new thing. And so from your presentation, it made me think that what you are suggesting is then that the problem is that we see ourselves as unlimited, that capitalism is kind of feeding us this lie that we are unlimited, when in fact we are limited by our natural resources. And so I guess my question is kind of what happens to the concept of, say, freedom or the possibility in capitalism that Marx brings up in the Grundrisse, talking about this kind of unlimited sense of like human potential when we're talking about capitalism and overcoming capitalism and kind of this limited environment that we have? And how do you reconcile kind of that point with seeing problems with the neo-Malthusian argument, I guess, is my question. Thanks.
Are there any other questions right now? Okay. So we'll just take a couple questions and then respond.
My question's also for Peter, and it's basically just an addendum to Aaron's question, which is regarding abstract labor. If I remember correctly, Peter, you said that we dominate ourselves through abstract labor. And so my question is, do you see anything emancipatory about abstract labor? Okay.
Peter, if you'd like to respond.
Oh, yeah. To the second question, no. I don't see anything emancipatory to it. I don't accept the notion that Moishe Postone has popularized that dead labor is the emancipatory alternative. I think only human beings is the emancipatory alternative. We get squeezed out by abstract labor, but abstract labor can never completely squeeze out concrete labor. That is, because it's human beings who are engaged in that actual laboring activity. So it's the resistance between the drive to reduce you to an abstraction and your refusal to be reduced to an abstraction that creates the possibility of resistance. So ultimately, I think, no, abstract labor is not the emancipatory potential, it's the reaction against it. In terms of the first question, very good question too, the question of unlimited has to be thought of in two different ways, and this is what exactly Marx is doing in the Grundrisse. When he talks about the absolute movement of becoming, he says, what is wealth if not the universality of needs, capacities, and enjoyments generated in a universal interchange of humanity, right? Here he's talking about a kind of unlimitedness, right? An absolute movement of becoming, which he's getting, of course, from Hegel, but it's not a concept of bad infinity, right? What is the concept of, you can never have enough culture, you can never have enough love, you can never have enough intellectual development, you can never have enough self-development of your talents and abilities. That is an unlimited in the good sense of the word. What we are talking about here, however, is material entities are a different matter, right? There are material limits, okay? To the exhaustion of the soil, et cetera, et cetera. Just think about what happens to farming and the destruction of the topsoil. There are limits to how much chemical fertilizer you can put on this stuff and still get a return on investment. What Marx realizes this near the end of his life. There's a wonderful piece that's published in this issue of Monthly Review by a Japanese scholar who's working on the Mega 2 project. He's publishing a volume of Marx's unpublished notes on agriculture and ecology from the end of his life, his notes on Liebig. Earlier in his career, Marx was confident that the use of chemical fertilizer in soil can boost productivity and overcome destruction of the soil. In the last decade of his life, he reverses his position on this and says there are fundamental natural limits that prevent even the application of the most developed chemical fertilizers to overcome these contradictions. So we have to think of two different types of unlimitedness, right? Marx was for a totality of human manifestations of life. That's his phrase from the 1844 manuscripts. That's a kind of absolute and unlimitedness that I embrace as a Marxist humanist. But there's another type of unlimitedness that capitalism tries to tell us, which is basically the acquisition of material wealth computed in monetary terms. And that is an incompatible position with natural sustainability. So there's two different conceptions. It's like what Hegel talks about, bad infinity versus a genuine infinity. You can recast this in terms of Marx's discussion and in terms of the discussion we have to have today on this issue. So that's why I don't think there's any contradiction to being a humanist and at the same time not being anthrocentric about nature.
In the back. And if the other panelists, if it's just directed at one panelist, if the other panelists want to respond to that, feel free as well.
Why don't we hear this question and we can...
Yeah.
I just came in for the last part of the panel, but if this has been covered already, then, let it be redundant and just, whatever. But I was wondering with the ongoing and current visibility of the of the Black liberation movement taking place and of indigenous peoples rising up against colonial oppression and whatever manifestation. I was wondering if the issue of climate change is being conceptualized within that, because much of colonialism is what, you know, is creating all of these changes, sustainable and, you know, perpetual through like the ankles say natural, but it's been proven. And I don't have to put a you know, a term of natural to it. It's been proven that these other ways of existing seem to be self-sustaining in lots of different proven ways. And now whenever there's a white face that says, oh, now I discovered this, and it's like, no, you just became aware of this. That's been around a long time before you. And actually people like you got rid of it and created the issue. So I'm wondering if having a lens of understanding colonialism and white supremacy and anti-indigeneity and anti-blackness is present in this discussion, because it's very much so present in what created these conditions to have this discussion taking place today to begin with.
And just to piggyback on what Tim was saying, and we did talk about it a little bit, but I just noticed and wanted to point out a parallel between the exploitation of the environment and also the exploitation of human labor, and how people being a part of the natural ecology has been absent from the capitalist mindset from the get-go. It's always been about exploitation for profit. And I think that, as the last speaker was hinting at towards the end of his talk, was the two movements do go hand in hand, and they have to, in order for the sustainability of not just the natural resources, but also human resources.
Would anybody like to respond?
So I'd like to attempt to answer the question. I think I'd want to talk about the situation in the United States first and then worldwide. And I want to talk about how the capitalists continue to deal with the issue. And then the problem in the so-called environmental movement, which, by the way, I don't believe we have an environmental movement. I think we have aspects of it. But having 400,000 people in New York City had good things about it, but it doesn't mean we have an environmental movement. So in the U.S., to be very concrete, and I'm sorry I don't remember the exact name of this book I read, but it has to do with basically cotton capitalism and slavery. So if anybody remembers the name of the book that's come out in the last 2 years, I'll get it for people by the end of the meeting when I look it up. But this is a very important book because, first of all, I think most people in their understanding of history don't realize how fundamental the role of cotton was, and slavery in terms of moving the U.S. to the position of, by the end of the 19th century, changing from being a semi-colonial power to the beginning of imperialism in the world. If there was one thing in the U.S. that did that, it was the question of cotton and the relationship between the northern industrial capitalist and the plantation owners in the South, and the exploitation, of course, of African and African-American slaves. I think that continues. In 1982 in Warren County, African-American farmers using techniques, strategy, and tactics they learned directly from the civil rights movement laid down in front of trucks that were going to make the biggest PCP landfill in the United States in North Carolina. And that was the beginning of what's known as the environmental justice movement. One problem we have is that there's a big difference between the environmental justice movement now, of where it's at, and then, but there's a huge difference between environmental justice and climate justice. Environmental justice is formulated right now primarily in an alliance called the Climate Justice Alliance. That is basically run by participatory organizations of people of color throughout the United States. The climate justice movement in the U.S. and internationally is primarily run by white upper middle class trained intellectuals. Not saying that they don't have good intentions, but who has more, usually the ability to fly all over the world to attend all these meetings, including COP21 coming up in Paris. So I think that's a really key issue. The other thing is that there are certain other elephants, I don't know if you can see that one in the corner, that really do relate to the question of race, colonialism, and imperialism. And the biggest elephant, and this is a big thing that we have to overcome, and I'm including myself as a leftist in the environmental, network, is the question of Malthus' population and his disciple for the last 50 years, Paul Ehrlich. Paul Ehrlich and Barry Commoner chased each other around college campuses for about 10 years, starting about 40 years ago. And one had evidence, and the other one was basically an alarmist who was based on hypothesis, on racism, on US imperialism. Barry Commoner worked with anthropologists throughout the world, with statisticians, to show in college campus after college campus that basically people never stabilized their population until they had a certain amount of economic stability, access to education, and access freely to the question of birth control. I don't mean forced sterilization, as happened throughout the United States, in the South, Puerto Rico, et cetera. I mean their own free will to get access to women's health and reproductive rights. The issue is still true now, although the statistics are pretty clear. People don't have to have a completely economic stable life, but whether they're in a village or they're in a city, if they have access to education, women, and they have access to their own reproductive rights, population is stabilized, okay? Paul Ehrlich never wants to deal with that issue. What he does, and it keeps coming up, and those of you who remember the Sierra Club vote on this issue and on the question of immigration, which happened in the last 5 years, it's one of the biggest things right underneath the surface that nobody seems to want to deal with. So we have to bring it out. We have to have an honest discussion about it. I would highly recommend you read Commoner's books, and you can see all kinds of Paul Ehrlich, videos all over the YouTube. But it's primarily based on that. When Paul Ehrlich is in New Delhi, there's too many people. When he's in Times Square, there's not too many people.
Well, what I was going to say is not related to that, but it's answering somewhat from my experience to this question, is that every time you involve someone into a process of activism, you sort of like awaken their political being. And so they move from one movement to another. And so like what we're seeing with like Black Lives Matter and things like that, we see like people trying to support the Black Lives Matter movement in different ways, and maybe they're doing that in terrible ways and stupid ways, but like they're trying. So like I think movements should definitely not eclipse one another, and yes, so like it's important to have radicals in sort of an environmental climate space, so-called, so we can educate others about, how they're wrong, and we can push them to more radical positions, so that we don't have this, sort of tradition from the Sierra Club or other big NGOs. So yeah, that's just one concrete way from my experience that I've seen. Like when I started doing this stuff, I became way more aware of other issues, right? And then I started to support those issues. So yeah, it's not like really a zero-sum game in sort of like when people become radicalized, I think.
Yeah, just briefly, I agree with what you said, that the destruction of nature is a consequence of the exploitation of nature is a consequence of the exploitation of human labor. But in the American, United States historical experience, what structures the exploitation of labor has always been racism. Class relations in this country and increasingly elsewhere in the world, like in Europe, are shaped and reconfigured by racial domination. So that is why those who argue that the class struggle is the fundamental contradiction got it wrong in the United States experience. Race has been the Achilles heel of American civilization. If you attack racism, then you're attacking the fundamental principle that is responsible for structuring the exploitative conditions of labor that we know of as constituting American society. And And this is also increasingly true of Europe, of course, where you can see what the labor force is structured as in Europe in terms of its immigrant labor and the racist attacks on immigrants. So this is why I think it's not an accident that throughout U.S. history, well, as Marx made the famous statement, labor in the white skin can't be emancipated as long as the labor in the black is branded, but that's not rhetoric. We know from American history that every forward movement of any struggle came as a result of initiative of black people struggling against racism and opening up new doors towards that question. And I think that's what we're seeing again today. Whether it be Black Lives Matter, or whether it be Black Youth Project, or whether it be any of these campus demonstrations, or whether it be Baltimore, what we're seeing is a really exciting moment. We don't know where it's going to lead to, but we know from prior moments of American history, this is where the women's movement originally came from. This is where the gay movement originally came from. This is where new stage of the labor struggle came out of. Black masses as vanguard. So I'm actually think there's a good possibility that this can not only open up, therefore, a challenge to the class structure of American society, but since, as you mentioned, it's that class structure which is responsible for the environmental degradation, this can open a new page in the fight against ecological destruction.
Lindsay, did you have?
I guess so, although that was a really good place to maybe end on that. But I guess to answer some of my own experience, I think a lot of indigenous rights and talking about race and class and gender is kind of inextricable from talking about some of these problematic terms, even of nature. I mean, I think I find a lot of that language like incredibly problematic because it does kind of continue to be used as this kind of language of nature and natural as being used against some of all of these kind of core struggles that are at play. You know, I think it's like sometimes most obvious in terms of, you know, like some of the gender and women's rights that are embedded in a lot of that language. And it's used to kind of continue to oppress in a lot of ways. But to answer the question, I think there are some conversations going around that, but I think there need to be a lot more.
I guess I want to point out another elephant in the room, or perhaps I should say it's more of a cow and a pig and a chicken and a bunch of fish, because something that oftentimes like I don't hear a lot on the left, and honestly it makes me not want to take the left seriously, is because they don't talk about animal agriculture and the impact that that has on climate change, and the fact, the overwhelming science behind animal agriculture over several studies that have been done over the years points to it being the #1 cause of global warming in so many ways, like the destruction of water, the destruction of land, and the destruction of the air, and also how it connects to issues of worker exploitation and how it destroys human health. Basically, there's so many ways that it's not only like the worst for the environment, but it's also horrible for people and obviously horrible for animals. Never gets its fair share on the left. So I'm just wondering, what you guys think about that, if that's something that we should consider.
Any other questions?
I have a twofold question. The first is for, I'm sorry, I forgot your name, but Howard. The first part is primarily for Howard, but then I have a more sort of general question for the whole, all the panelists. So for Howard, you sort of talked a little bit about how you see a sort of localism in a way, as being the solution to a lot of our environmental problems, that, if people who grow the food have the control over the food and consume the food, this kind of idea that that's better for the planet and for humanity. So my question is, how do you address the problem the growth of large, massive urban centers in the past 50 years in places that do have very scant natural resources in terms of food production. I mean, one city that I think of I think of it because I've been there, is Amman in Jordan, where, I mean, as a country, largely due to the legacy of colonialism, doesn't have very many natural resources itself, and so is almost like 90% dependent upon a global market to meet its needs. So my second question, though, is presumably the achievement of socialism would involve the rising of the living standard of the majority of the Earth's population, and in a quite significant way from the slums that millions and millions, a billion people are currently living in. So how do you reconcile that problem or that vision of socialism as raising everybody's living standards, including their consumption, with this environmentalist idea of the need to cut consumption?
Great questions from everybody. So to answer your first question, I think there's certain similarities between the question of food and energy. I don't consider myself a localist. I was giving an example that there are large amounts of food, particularly if you can grow food all year round, and that's another question, that you can do that both in an urban and a rural environment. That doesn't mean people are going to be able to grow all their food at this point, although that's part of that's a technical question of how you grow food. But the relationship between energy and food is that you still have a state, okay? Be it a capitalist state or a state that defines itself in a socialist sense. And that state, you have to basically take over the means of production, including the question of food. And so part of the food can be grown locally. Chicago, for example, had 7,500, gardens in World War II, and the estimate is that about half to two-thirds of all the vegetables, primarily vegetables, some fruits, that Chicagoans consumed at that time, where the population was actually probably a little bigger than it is now, because we've had, population degrowth, was grown in the city. That doesn't mean you can do it everywhere. So Amman, Jordan probably could not grow all their food, as far as I know right now. But then you have to deal with the question of how did the people get to the cities? So this is a question that started under feudalism, but really accelerated under capitalism. And now it's accelerating under both a so-called democratic capitalist system, the largest one in the world of which is India, and a so-called communist socialist system, China, where it's been going on for at least 3 decades or more. And so this is forced migration into the cities, forced in a couple of ways. Number one is that people are made all these promises that life is better in the city, you can get a job. There's a great book, by the way, if people haven't heard of it, called Factory Girls, written by a Chinese American, that is the best documentation of this I've seen in terms of real stories. In the case of India, the present Minister of the Interior made a statement the day after his boss was elected, saying that he's going to drive 90% of the remaining Indians into the cities by 2020. So this is setting up civil war. Parts of China have gotten close to civil war, and so the question of who has the right to grow food on land in rural areas is really key, and how that food is going to be grown. Which gets to the question about animals. So people didn't wake up one day with an animal gene, saying, oh yeah, we want more meat, whatever. I think everybody here is very clear about how, animals have been pushed around the world as part of U.S. imperialism, whether it's McDonald's or it's a so-called Green Revolution in terms of how people were forced to grow food in a certain way. So that's a question, that we have to deal with. I think it's a relationship between people individually dealing with the question, and to develop kind of a broad program about why eating a plant-based diet is cheaper, which is a thing I think that leftists in the environment don't think about enough. You have to appeal to people's pocketbooks. It's a lot cheaper to eat a plant-based diet. Wherever you go shopping, it's a lot cheaper. But it's also healthier, et cetera, et cetera. So I think that's a long discussion, but yes, you're absolutely right. People haven't taken that up. The last thing I just want to make a comment on regarding the question of race. Lenin first, there were elements of it in Marx, but Lenin first defined in a much more deeper way the national question. The national question was taken up to a certain extent by whites in the Communist Party in the 20s and 30s, but not very well, and certainly not very well in practice. That's why thousands, I don't mean hundreds, thousands of African Americans and Latinos left the Communist Party before and after World War II. It's by, if you read anything about Paul Robeson's autobiography and other, famous African Americans who were part of the left, I think you get a good understanding. The problem is we still haven't dealt with the national question on the left. There are huge numbers of organizations right now, whether they call themselves anarchist organizations, socialist organizations, communist organizations, that using the theory that was developed by Marx and Lenin, even if that theory was not correctly applied, have not figured out what that means right now in the present conditions in the United States. Because the theory was not applied well. It even wasn't applied well by Julius Nyerere, who was one of the more important socialist leaders in sub-Saharan Africa.
I just want to say something really quick about the veganism question. I'm sorry, localism annoys me so much because it's that when I hear the term localism, I hear something else in the climate justice movement, which is people having their romantic dreams to go back to their farms and such things. Yeah, I come across a lot of vegans too. And yeah, you're my favorite vegan, Minku, because you're also an anti-capitalist. Yeah, when I encounter these people with different identities, I think that's what's like so appealing to me about anarchism and variegated forms of Marxism, is like all these different subjectivities, all these different people who are really strongly aligned with different views towards things, and like when you're an anarchist and you're trying to do something consensually, you have to respect that part of them, and you have to respect that subjectivity even if you don't agree with it, maybe. And for me, the vegan question is certainly animal consumption is a problem. I don't know if it's the problem in terms of emissions, actually. So what I would say is when you encounter someone like who's a vegan, that lifestyle requires an incredible amount of discipline. And I would say be respectful and meet people where they're at. And intellectual arguments are cool, but you know what? Some people, like, the best way to win them to your view is to involve them in what you're doing. It's that simple. And not to have a cynical or judgmental attitude towards people of these persuasions.
I just kind of want to point out, I think it's pretty interesting in a lot of these questions, which are really, really great questions. But that, just like kind of hearing everybody's responses, that agriculture ends up being at this kind of like central point to how we kind of contend with or address or deal with or think through a lot of these larger questions. And it's this kind of moment or this location or site where we have to make really practical decisions, but also really personal decisions, and also really systematic decisions about how these things are going to play out. I think in terms of animal consumption, yeah, just to kind of reiterate a little bit of what's been said, it's, I think a lot of people have their kind of own line of empathy, like where do you relate to, or kind of decide things. And I think there's room for a lot of that within these discussions of climate change. I guess that's all, yeah.
Yeah, I mean, that was an omission, perhaps. I mean, when I talk about the ecological crisis, I very often bring in this crazy meat consumption that is that does tremendous amount of damage. But at the same time, I think we have to can't have any illusions about what large-scale agriculture of vegetable production and grain production does to the world ecosystem as well. I mean, there's a good book written many years ago called The Myth of Vegetarianism. Some of you are probably familiar with. You should take a look at it. AK Press has republished it recently. It's the mode of production that has to be transformed, not simply what is produced, although certainly meat consumption is one of the short-term immediate things that can be brought down to make an immediate environmental impact. And this is one of the really downsides of what's happening in Bolivia, is they're exporting huge amounts of soybean production to China to feed China's cattle industry, which is really doing a lot of environmental destruction. I don't have to tell you how much chemical fertilizer has to go into that, and of course the chemical fertilizer is based on fossil fuel. Just on this point about socialism and consumption standards, I find it hard to talk about cutting consumption standards when 40% of the world's population is undernourished, okay? So I don't think the problem is cutting consumption levels in general. I think there's plenty of enough food to go around the world right now. There's probably a surplus of food. It's the way it's distributed and who it's getting it. 40% of Americans are overweight or obese, and 40% of the world is malnourished and starving. Something is rotten in the state of Denmark, okay? So it is, yes, socialism would involve a dramatic increase in living standards for large sectors of the world population, but can it be done in a sustainable way, even on a distributive level? Undoubtedly. I mean, we consume too much in the United States. I mean, just take a look at what the energy embodiment in this building is. It could be done in a different way. And there's all kinds of, you know, things that are happening. I mean, one thing, it's going to sound kind of weird perhaps, but one of the London tubes shut down. So somebody got the brilliant idea to grow mushrooms in them, and then they just shoot the mushrooms upstairs and they take them to these gourmet restaurants to sell them. So instead of having to import them from the countryside and have all that transit cost and fuel cost, now these restaurants are being able to serve their porcini mushrooms that are just picked 20 minutes before. It sounds like a kind of weird idea, but this is right in the middle of a city of 14 million people. There's hundreds of different ways that we can satisfy global food supply in non-traditional manners if we put our minds to it. So I think we can take care of that. I think we have to have the freedom to do that.
So I wanted to bring up the couple you mentioned, Naomi Klein's book. And in that rather thick tome, she has a tendency to talk about, even though she will discuss the environmental movement going back to the New Deal and Sierra Club, she has a tendency to concentrate her argument on the development of what she calls the neoliberal system of economic domination. And she treats capitalism as an economic system that's extracting wealth from the earth, and at the same time forcing somehow like social domination in the process of doing this. What she doesn't really address is the way in which neoliberalism is in many ways neoliberalism can't really be divorced from her own politics. The resurrection of liberalism in the form of her anarchism, the sort of assumption that politics have to occur at the level of individuals and communities organizing themselves without ever actually understanding or trying to deal with the ways in which that's going to become an international problem, where it actually will have to confront the state, and possibly develop into situations where states are going to confront each other in a way that might be indicative of the wars of the first half of the 20th century. So I was hoping you could each articulate in some way what you think the politics of mediation means in the present. What you think, given the sort of state of the left at the moment, what are the sort of directions in which the left can take in a way that will not merely repeat the errors of the past?
I can't resist. But
Any other questions right now?
This is just real quick for Joy. I was wondering if you could address kind of, because you mentioned kind of the definition you have, like the difference between like thinking about strategy or like theory and then like action. And I know Peter in particular responded to that saying that, well, how are we sure that this activism isn't going to be counterproductive to our theory? And so I was wondering if you could just kind of address how you bridge the gap between the two. Thank you.
Yeah, that is the question. Like, that's part of why I joined an anarchist federation, because I was like, yeah, I need to think, like, we all need to think as leaders about theory. And I think, yeah, bridging the gap. So I'm not anti-intellectual, I would say. I would say I consider like the guidance of intellectuals to be very important, and analyses that I can't do because I'm just exhausted, right? There's a division of labor. What else can I say? I guess I don't know, I'm like the elementary school teacher of the movement, I guess. I feel like, and to, yeah, so like, how can this not be like reactionary or like destructive to more productive measures? That's an important question. I don't fully identify with like what Naomi Klein has said, where I think, and I think she started saying the same things right around the anti-globalization movement. I don't know if you noticed. She said the same things pretty much, I think. And so it's like deja vu. And then it's also really weird because the Paris attacks happened. So it's this like deja vu again for the anti-globalization movement, which is also like nested in this climate justice. It's really just like a bunch of older anti-globalization anarchists and me and such of our tendency. So we're all trying to grapple with this idea of strategy. Part of my answer to this, is it going to be reactionary? I have no idea how solving a practical problem directly is reactionary. I also don't have any idea how, for instance, you know, like, I guess causing different problems within something is a problem. Like I see your view, but I think politics is based on what people choose to do, if you know what I'm saying. Like, yeah, we leverage a power, but it's from our collective power and our collective will, which is the true seat of politics. And so the consequences of that are something we need to own. But that is where, that's where, you know, political power, true political power comes from, is the people. So if problems result from that, I mean, problems are, in a sense, inevitable, right? Even like the most stateless societies, they have their problems, and that's part of the human condition. And part of the draw towards more authoritarian modes is that we can somehow solve this in like a very systematic way. And I think that is in itself a problem. So yeah, but I'm also concerned about causing problems for other movements and things like that.
Well, I'm going to say something that might be a little bit controversial, but I'll I like that sometimes. And that is, I think we should stop all this talk about neoliberalism. I think it's superficial and diversionary to targeting the real problem. Yes, of course there's neoliberalism, but it's the phenomenal expression of a certain stage of capital in certain areas. But people very often act as if neoliberalism is, when people focus on neoliberalism as if that's the problem, a specific form of capitalism at this particular stage, what do they very often fall into? The old counterposing of free market versus the free market versus planned economy. Okay, back to the state and statism. By the way, that's my criticism of Michael Leibowitz. When you read Leibowitz, although he has some good things to say, he treats the state as a neutral instrument that revolutionaries can just seize, like in Venezuela, and take over, as if the state is not going to take over them, which is usually what happens. Here is where I have a lot of affinities with the best of the anarchist tradition, by the way. A lot of my friends tell me I'm too anarchist for a Marxist and too Marxist for an anarchist. But in any case, I think and that's my problem with Naomi Klein, is that she has adopted so much of this language of neoliberalism that you don't get any real discussion of the inner core of what drives capitalism as such. You can be against neoliberalism, but that doesn't mean you're against capitalism. You can even say you're against the capitalists, but that doesn't mean you're against the law of value that drives capitalism. So in my view, the best part of her book is the title, This Changes Everything. But I wish it changed some of her theoretical categories, her approach to the issue of climate change. I don't think it's done so. And I think that, you know, if you look at even the most progressive regimes in the world, some of which we've talked about, yeah, a lot of them are very anti. The Chinese government is, I don't think you can call that a neoliberal model, right? It's a horrible model. I mean, it's one of the most horribly destructive environmental models anywhere. It's got the worst of Stalinism and capitalism rolled into each other. Not that there's that much of a difference between the two. But if we focus simply on this neoliberalism, we're scratching the surface. Capitalism might have to shift away from a neoliberal model at some point. That doesn't mean it's going to be any less destructive.
Okay, so the question was about the politics of mediation and how to avoid repeating some of the mistakes of neoliberalism.
Of the past in general,
Of the past in
leftists,
general, the
the
leftist
failure of the left over the course of 200 years.
I mean, I think that's actually like a really exciting time frame, and I would even extend it further. I feel so strange, I think, on this panel a little bit, because I think I'm realizing as we're sitting here all talking that, like, maybe I'm coming from this perspective of kind of accepting that, or like looking for strategies of acceptance that, like, we're not going to overcome climate change in the foreseeable future. And I think, yeah, maybe articulating that clearly can help address this question, where I think that the only way, or at least what I see as kind of the next step for us as human beings to not repeat these mistakes, is to continue these processes of decentering, which came, you know, from Copernicus, and moved on to, like, even, you know, Freud, or anything that kind of pushes us away from this really strong central position in the universe. You know, artificial intelligence, Deep Blue, you know, the guy who was defeated by the computer chess player. These moments of kind of accepting this loss that we're going through, I think, is where I'm coming from. And so these practices of being able to relate to other organisms that are already resisting. You know, I was just reading really recently about this study in 2006 that indicated that poison ivy is really thriving in conditions of climate change. The increased CO2 levels is making it more potent. It's making it grow bigger and better leaves. And I find that to be like an incredibly amazing moment to practice losing yourself to to what's going on. Yeah, and to practice a certain amount of powerlessness too. I think that's kind of, yeah, that's where I'm coming from in all of this, is in this longer time frame. That I don't think that any of these structures that we have in place will be able to get us out of this mess. That it comes to really redefining what this we is, and giving a certain amount of patience to a really long-term look at it.
So I think it's really important that whatever our ideological view is, we really have to balance being positive about things, that things are objectively positive. So with all due respect to Platypus, who invited me to come here, I think to say that the left has been a failure for 200 years is absolutely, totally unrealistic. The revolutions that took place starting in the Soviet Union were not complete failures. That's not a dialectical way to look at things. It's not objective in terms of the lives of billions of people that have been affected by socialism. To say that the outcome was totally positive, of course not. There were huge problems in the Soviet Union. But, you know, we could sit here the rest of the night and talk about the successes that happened, the fact that those successes were then squashed by different people who took control, let's say Stalin. Even at the end of Lenin's life, there were things that happened. But I've been in Cuba, I've been in Nicaragua, I've been in Tanzania, and I've been in Bolivia, and I've worked there, you know, as a physician and as a leftist, you know, for months at a time. And if you go there and you ask people, well, do you think the revolution, everything Evo did was wrong? People are going to tell you, no, you're nuts. I mean, do they agree with everything about Evo? Do they agree with everything about Fidel? Do they agree with everything about Julius Nyerere? And certainly they don't agree with everything about Daniel Ortega. They're gonna look at you like, well, who are you to question this? That's a Western European, white North American view that basically socialism has been a failure, or the left has been a failure. Okay, the left has a lot of problems. We have a lot of problems in this country, and the main problem we have is not to be able to unite on common ground and develop a revolutionary program that's going to take us out of capitalism. That's the main problem I see that we have. You know, these discussions are great, and I think it helps clarify things, but I would totally disagree that the left, that socialism, that people who work there have been a failure. And I'll give you the concrete example that I mentioned in my talk. I would really encourage you to read the monthly review about Soviet ecology in the 20th century, in terms of the fact that they were not only people who came up with ideas, but they implemented these ideas even under Stalin. The terrible situation that happened in the Soviet Union with a degradation environment would have been 100 times worse if these people hadn't been willing to lay down their lives to fight for it. In terms of Naomi Klein, I think her book overall is positive for people who are not people like ourselves. I think the fact that she raises the issue of capitalism and she puts it forward in relationship to the environment in probably the most popular book that's ever been written, that's a positive thing. Is she truly an anti-capitalist? Absolutely not. She totally believes that this question, as people have talked about, can be solved by just somehow magically snapping your fingers and getting rid of what she calls disaster capitalism / neoliberalism. She specifically says in the book, these things are totally contradictory, right? She says on the one hand, well, if we just go back to the New Deal or to the Marshall Plan, why, Naomi, did the New Deal and Marshall Plan happen? One was to stave off the Communist Party in the United States. The other one was to stave off the Communist Party in all of Western Europe, you know, starting with Greece and sending in the Marines, you know, by Truman. So I think she's a big contradiction. I think our job is certainly to go through with a fine-tooth comb and to see where we have points of unity and points of not having unity. But the problem with the left, if we want to talk about problems, is the fact that we have given everything over to the big greens, starting with 350.org and Avaz, okay? They got $8 million to run the People's Climate March. What was the first thing they did? They squashed everybody coming up with slogans to unite people against capitalism. That was a principle. You could not go there with slogans for the whole march. And we could spend the rest of the night talking about those two groups. But those two groups right now don't just have control of the media, don't just have control of what's going to happen for the U.S. delegation, you know, in Paris, including the majority of EJ groups of people of color. They have control of the whole thing right now because we haven't figured out, not that we individually can't figure things out, we haven't united to come up with a different program. And that's what I was hoping one thing that could come out of this was. Because if we leave it in the hands of Bill McKibben, who's probably one of the most undemocratic people, and if you want to talk about democracy, how many people here went to his event on the North Side 2 years ago in the Athenaeum Theater or anything, okay? How many questions did you get to ask? Okay? 350.org, if you want to talk about Stalinist and run from the top down, there is no democracy in that organization, you know? So I think what we have to do is we have to figure out, like, where tactically we might agree with certain things, but there's a fundamental way that they're running things. The divestment campaign may have been good in some symbolic ways to raise people's consciousness. It was an absolute diversion, okay? Because while the whole thing was going on, you know, 5 more pipelines were built to bring all that tar sands into the United States. And we heard about Keystone XL, which was a great victory, not primarily, I don't think, because of 350.org, but because of Native American groups, cowboy groups, Bold, Nebraska, stuff like that. That's really where it came from.
Rising Tide.
Rising Tide, thank you. So I think that's the challenge here, brothers and sisters, is let's come up with another realistic program we can implement that so not everything's going to be done by 350.org, Avaz, et cetera, et cetera.
So I think